Okay, so for these videos, I want to talk specifically about Tim O'Brien and this idea of writing about trauma. So in the book, there's a lot of sort of self-reflection where we have the author reflecting back on his experience and sort of talking about the process of writing about these stories that we're reading. So there's a lot of sort of self-reflection, right? So he is writing about the experience of writing the traumatic memories that he has of his experience in Vietnam. So on page 36, we can start by sort of looking at one of these passages where he writes about what it's like to go back in his mind and revisit all of these moments, particularly traumatic moments in his past experience. So on page 36, he says, I'm 43 years old and a writer now, and the war has been over a long while. Much of it is hard to remember. I sit at this typewriter and stare through my words and watch Kiowa sinking into the deep muck of a shit field, or Kurt Lemon hanging in pieces from a tree. And I write about these things, the remembering is turned into a kind of rehappening. Kiowa yells at me. Kurt Lemon steps from the shade into bright sunlight, his face brown and shining, and then he soars into a tree. The bad stuff never stops happening. It lives in its own dimension, replaying itself over and over. So in that instance, it does sound like a kind of post-traumatic reoccurrence or repetition where his writing becomes a kind of way to revisit or relive these moments. And you would sort of think that, you know, somebody who survived an incident, events that are this traumatic wouldn't want to revisit those moments. They would want to just forget them and move on. But it seems as if, you know, you have to sort of talk about and share that part of yourself, talk about those moments in order to get some sort of closure or help you sort of encompass your brain, so to help you sort of cope and appreciate that moment. It's necessary to talk about it. So that was the same with what Freud discovered with his talking cure, right? So the more you talked about it, you could sort of compose yourself, and the memories would no longer be nightmares. They would no longer happen when you didn't want them to, but you could consciously remember them, and in that way you sort of master them, right? So you have a little bit more control over the events of the past, your memories, and you sort of gain a sense of control again in your life. So you're not haunted by memories anymore because you're consciously bringing these memories to life through your writing or through sharing your story with others. The opposite would be repression, right? So if you didn't talk about your past, if you kept all those haunting memories stuffed down into your mind and repressed them, eventually they would resurface as symptoms. So you would grow sick, unhappy, depressed, and have a whole slew of symptoms because you're not consciously dealing with something that was traumatic in your past. So for Tim O'Brien, it seems as if his writing and the act of storytelling takes on almost like a healing quality. And I don't know if even he's sort of consciously aware of the healing process of his writing, but he does sort of, especially in the story with Norman Boker, talk about how he was able to sort of avoid some of the post-traumatic symptoms by writing about his story. So we can see in the section of notes, he comments on the process, right? So his process of avoiding some of that post-traumatic stress disorder So he says on page 179, in ordinary conversation, I never spoke much about the war, certainly not in detail, and yet ever since my return, I had been talking about it virtually nonstop through my writing. Telling stories seemed a natural, inevitable process, like clearing the throat. Partly catharsis, partly communication. It was a way of grabbing people by the shirt and explaining exactly what had happened to me, how I'd allowed myself to get dragged into a wrong war, all the mistakes I've made, all the terrible things I had seen and done. So he says, I did not look at my work as therapy and still don't, yet when I received Norman Volker's letter, it occurred to me that the act of writing had led me through a swirl of memories that might otherwise have ended in paralysis or worse. By telling stories, you objectify your own experience, you separate it from yourself, you pin down certain truths, you make up others. So the process of writing and telling his stories, he does credit that with some way of separating those memories from himself, and a way for him to avoid some of the negative consequences that the other soldiers face in their post-war lives. And it seems as if there are, two very sort of traumatic moments in Tim O'Brien's war experience. The one that caught my eye was his story about killing a man, called The Man I Killed. And in this story, we have him sort of as a young maid at an oncoming Vietnamese man who was walking down a trail, and the grenade went off, killed the man, and then Tim O'Brien is staring at the body of this man who he has just killed, and imagining what this man's life might have been like. So all of the descriptions of this young man who has died are sort of projections of Tim O'Brien's, right? So he couldn't have known what this man's life was really like, but his imagination, so as an author and writer, he can imagine what this young man's life might have been like. And he's also projecting some of his own anxieties or thoughts, feelings onto this young man. And there are sort of similarities between his own story about, being dragged into this war, not wanting to, and then eventually succumbing to, the pressures, social pressures, cultural pressures of joining, enlisting, rather than being viewed as a coward. He also imagines that this young man who has just died also feels the same cultural pressure to live up to an ideal of masculinity. So on page 140, we have Tim O'Brien imagining what this young man, what his struggles were before he died. So he reflects on what this young man might have gone through. And he says, he was not a communist, he was a citizen and a soldier. In the village of Mai Khe, as in all of Quang Nang, patriotic resistance had the force of tradition, which was partly the force of legend, and from his earliest boyhood, the man I killed had listened to stories about the heroic Trung sisters, and Tran Hang Dao's famous rout of the Mongols, and the Li Loi final victory against the Chinese at Totong. He had been taught that to defend the land was a man's highest duty and highest privilege. He accepted this. It was never open to question. Secretly, though, it also frightened him. He was not a fighter. His health was poor, his body small and frail. He liked books. He wanted someday to be a teacher of mathematics. At night, lying on his mat, he could not picture himself doing the brave things his father had done, or his uncles, or the heroes of the stories. He hoped in his heart that he would never be tested. So we see Tim O'Brien sort of projecting or making up this story of what this young man might have faced in his decision to serve in the military. And it sounds a lot like the narrative that we read earlier, where Tim O'Brien on the Rainy River faced some cultural and family pressures to do his sort of patriotic duty, to not be viewed as a coward, and to live up to these sort of ideas of manhood. So we see on both sides, the Vietnamese, Viet Cong soldier and the American soldier, both young men, both felt pressure to conform and meet unrealistic expectations of courage, to prove their manhood and masculinity through violence and warfare, and are sort of caught up in this war that neither of them was particularly passionate about or believed in. So it's both young men sort of caught up in patriarchal or the myths of masculinity, and this young man dies as a result of his involvement. So this instance of when Tim O'Brien is responsible for this young man's death is something that does haunt him, and he continually thinks about it, and he can't stop staring at this body, right? So the reality of his actions are very sort of hard to make sense of, and he even denies it. So when his daughter asks him whether he's ever killed anybody, he says, of course not. But at the same time, he seems to also say that, you know, he had to tell her that, he wanted to tell her the truth, but it's because of this traumatic moment in his past that he keeps writing these war stories. So it seems as if there's still not any resolution or closure for him in regards to his involvement in this young man's death and in the war as a whole. So in the next story, Ambush, he does imagine what possibly could have been. So sometimes he says he has these daydreams where he just lets that young man pass on the trail without throwing the grenade. You know, what would have happened? So there is this sort of lingering, you know, doubt or feeling of guilt, or, you know, you're not fully resolved about your actions. So in this sense, there is a little bit of, I think, survivor's guilt or post-traumatic evidence of the sort of repetition of this event, this memory in his mind. So it is one of those circumstances in his war career that he remains sort of ambivalent or ambiguous about, not knowing what he did in that instance was the right decision or not. So it's something that continually sort of haunts him. Tim O'Brien will also write about revisiting the field where his friend Kiowa died that day. So, you know, decades after Tim and his daughter Kathleen returned to Vietnam, and this is in the short story called Field Trip, he revisits that very same field where Kiowa drowns, and he buries Kiowa's old hunting hatchet in the mud as kind of a tribute to his friend. And in the short story, Tim O'Brien will reflect on his own transformation throughout the war and how it changed him from the young, naive, innocent young man, young boy who he was, into somebody who was a little bit more angry, bitter, and just altered by the war. He became sort of colder and more sort of no longer the same man that he was once before.